How do you manage that overwhelming wave of data? How do you manage all of the different types of services? You almost are mandated to start changing the core of the network to get ready for that.
If you look at the way that networks are evolving, it's moving everything towards the cloud. So of course we have to focus on software as a key element of the mix.
Of maximum importance for us to keep the standards evolving in the best way.
We should work together on that standardization, that interoperability, and kind of feed off of each other to drive that innovation cycle.
You got to make sure that you're embarking on a transformation on the people front as well as process front.
Service providers, over-the-top guys, application providers, car manufacturers, all these verticals, we're going to have to work closer and closer.
A lot of our customers are standing up voice over LTE for the first time. They've got a simple choice. Am I going to buy a box to do that the old-fashioned way, which will become a boat anchor in 5 years' time? Or am I going to license a piece of software and deploy it on standard off-the-shelf hardware, in which case it'll live forever in my network? It's a very simple and easy choice to make at that point.
Drive some of this standardization, but leverage that NFV platform, whether it's virtual network functions onboarding or federations or API standards, etc. So we become more software centric. And as we all know, software is king. That's the way to success.
Hello, good evening and welcome to this TelecomTV Main Agenda Live. I'm Martyn Warwick, the Editor-in-Chief of TelecomTV, and we'll be moderating the panel this evening. We're here in the Hotel de Anza in downtown San Jose in California. And this is a famous old hotel, very old by some standards in the United States. Began to build it in 1929, about the time of the Wall Street crash, and it was finished in 1931, quite a while before Prohibition was repealed. I didn't mean to say you couldn't get a drink in here. We do know that much. And they were cheap too. So, having said that, let's talk about this event. It's a TelecomTV live event sponsored by Intel and Nokia, and we're looking at the proposition that transformation is not simply a CSP challenge. It's a challenge for the vendors as well, and others, and we'll get into that in a minute. But before we start, I would, of course, obviously like to introduce this very knowledgeable panel. And I'm going to start with the lady on my left, Jehanne Savi, who is Executive Leader, All IP and On-Demand Network Program at Orange. Welcome, Jehanne. Jehanne has come the farthest today by far. She has just arrived from Paris, and for her it is 4:30 in the morning. So she's doing brilliantly well.
I need your support.
Next to her on her left is Ron Haberman, VP Emerging Products at Nokia, who hasn't come very far at all.
But with traffic.
But the traffic's really bad. Okay. Next to him is Sean Hockel, who is Vice President Verizon. I don't know how far you've come.
New Jersey.
Sean? New Jersey.
I was just happy to get out.
Yeah. He said it. And last but by no means least, down at the far end there, is Lynn Comp, Senior Director, Industry Enabling and Marketing Vendor Ecosystem at Intel Corporation. Lynn, welcome again. Glad to see you here.
Good to see you.
Hope you can hear me all right.
Oh, no problem. 2 hours, Portland. It's all good.
Okay. Well, yes, yeah, not come that far either. So, and we've not come we've come from Campbell, so it's not too far. Right, let's get into this. And let's begin by suggesting that NFV and SDN have occasioned massive change in the global industry, not least because it's occasioned the transformation of the old customer service provider market and industry that we used to know so well. That's one thing that's happening, but at the same time, vendors, I believe, will also have to change as well to accommodate what's actually happening around the place and to see how they can best serve this new dynamic of the transformed network. And I'm going to give my first question to Jehanne, which is this: the value chain, the traditional value chain that we've seen before. How do you see, as a representative from a CSP, how do you see that value chain changing? And where are vendors are going to sit on it? Are they going to be in one place, or are they going to be transcendental in several places at the same time?
Yes, obviously the value chain is evolving, and for the vendors, I think it's probably obvious that it will be significant also for their positioning, and they should evolve in their positioning not only on the value chain of the global ecosystem of the traditional vendors as well as pure IT players. So what we expect from the CSP standpoint is that the vendors clearly assume this shift of their value model or of their business model, and clearly probably split their activities between their infrastructure provider activities or cloud platform activities, their rather VNF vendor activities that are rather an editor model, an IT editor model, and there may be also integrator activities since we still need a kind of end-to-end integration, and that will be one probably key issues of this SDN and NFV advent to make it integrated end-to-end, as well as able to be manageable all along the life cycle management journey. That could be a point. So to make it short, and from our standpoint, really, we expect this split because it's different business model. If you want to position yourself in the cloud platform, in the VNF, or in the integration, it's different business models. And we also probably would source different vendors. And there's this question that Ron mentioned that the second VNF is probably the most difficult, and then the job is done. I think that's a good illustration also of the necessity for the service provider to have different providers and probably a multi-vendor ecosystem, but not homogeneously on this value chain, depending on the positioning.
Thank you. Ron, mentioned there of second VNF. What does that mean?
What it means is a way to illustrate how a true cloud design can be achieved. So we work today a little bit in two extremes, right? On the one hand, we do primarily system deals where operators are essentially buying stacks of different applications, different use cases that come prepackaged with everything required. And on the other, pure play in layered approach, right? So either an orchestrator by itself, hardware by itself, an NFVI layer by itself, where software will come at some point in the future. And the second VNF concept from my perspective is the test of going from one to the other. So if you look at what it takes to have a design for a single VNF on infrastructure and you deploy it, the moment where you try to allocate enough room, orchestration, onboarding for the second VNF on the same infrastructure as opposed to a different stack, you've solved most of what you're going to have to solve to add the third and the fourth and the fifth. Okay? So that step is the hardest one, to go from a system integrated deal to a true cloud environment. That's the second VNF approach.
Thank you. Right. Sean, Verizon. What do you make of the vendor value chain and ecosystem now? And is it adapting to the needs of the CSPs as quickly or as effectively as you think it might? And if not, why not?
So I think in a lot of cases, we see a lot of innovation coming out of our supplier partners, but there's also a sort of a troubling trend in terms of their desire to do two kind of things, right? One, they keep inventing an enterprise sales force to kind of reach around and go direct to try to stream off the top end of the customer. And that forces, you know, a certain amount of behavior. And then they backdoor that into trying to offer a software as a service model where, hey, wouldn't it just be great if we just built this cloud for you and you could just put it through there, which really effectively makes me a coupon clip, you know, and take the coupon from the customer and pass along the lead and everything's good, which is, of course, is, you know, our value to the customer is our ability to operationalize technology. And so the notion of handing that over to folks is a little bit of a challenge. And it recreates a model where it's difficult for any of the participants to make a decent return on investment for capital, right? Where we're essentially creating an environment where there's multiple sources to a single SKU, where people are horse trading to try to get super efficient distribution to get to the last few points of margin. And it really, if you want us to adopt, you know, I have plenty of services I can do that with. If you want me to adopt the new technology, we have to find new ways to add value to the customer and recognize the value of that intellectual property. And if it's really just a horse race to putting the same basic set of features and functions in kind of a slightly new delivery package, that's going to be, you're going to see these SPs having a really hard time investing a ton of money in that model.
So I take it then, so yeah, I'm just going to say that, so basically your thesis is that you're not really a fan of software as a service.
I am not.
And I mean, that's clear. Ron.
So let me maybe try to make an argument for why software as a service does make sense, at least in some cases. And granted, not everybody will go for every model, and by far we're not going to try to argue that it's the only model, right? So all disclaimers aside, we see quite a lot of operators now trying to take advantage of the fact that they will no longer have to deal with things like upgrades. As new features come in, they don't want to have to continue to deal with the life cycle of the feature set of a particular software, and if they can consume it as a service from a vendor, they would like to take advantage of it. Now, I understand what you're saying when it comes to a value add, but it's not a replacement of how the software works. It's just a delivery model, a business model that takes some of the load in managing the installation off your hands. It's just part of a component of the chain. And at any point in time, of course, if you're not happy with the vendor delivering it, you can replace them, right? It's not locking you in any way.
Before you respond.
Did you see me lean forward? Because I was ready.
I could see you building to it. Lynn's down there a long way. Hi, Lynn.
Hi.
Good to see you again. Before you do that, let's bring Lynn in. I don't want to leave her. I can only just see her.
Separate the two. Keep them.
Lynn, what's your take on this? There's obviously fisticuffs about to evolve here. What is your take on this? When we were talking off camera before we started, you said, basically, I've seen this before. Can you explain?
It's a fascinating evolution to watch because most of my career I've been in communications, but I was in cloud and enterprise for about 4.5 years, and my job was helping automate and onboard functions and features. Orchestration was a key part of that. And I also watched the enterprise go through the evolution of the whole experience. We want to get out of HR having their own server in the data center with their name on it. And so then the great triumph the next year was we have decoupled the software and the hardware together in a virtual machine, but it's one app on the server that you had one app on last year. So you go through this whole evolution that I watched the service providers going through with, I got one VNF going, yay! Oh, where's the next one? And it's just a normal part of the journey of being able to take something that has been purpose-built and has been solely owned and going into a decoupled shared resource model. And I do find that there are a couple areas where I think service providers could be more specific and concrete. So things like standard benchmarking, I do think if you look at the enterprise and the cloud environment, you had Google and Facebook throw code into open source and say, if you want to know how you can be more competitive in my market, go run that and show me the results. So it was very helpful for the suppliers in that ecosystem, in that evolution, to know what am I pointing at in this new world? Because you don't have the same kind of dimensioning when you have 5 EPC boxes that make up the application and it serves 1 million subscribers. Well, what does that look like on a server that's running possible different memory configurations? And so we have to be able to help them go through that, but the operators can help by being concrete and saying, go that way, here's the APIs, here's the benchmarks, here's the performance characteristics that we expect, and maybe not putting 5 nines everywhere would be helpful as well. Just a suggestion. But also I've seen the suppliers have done a really good job. I've been surprised how quickly that they have moved forward in initially saying, that's great, you can have SDN and NFV, and it's sort of the joke about Ford. You can have anything you want as long as it's black. But there's a significant amount of diversity supporting different hardware suppliers with VNFs and with orchestration capabilities, or supporting it with your hardware using somebody else's VNF and orchestrator. And I think we're just working through going from simplicity to diversity. Network Builders has been really along this journey to try and help. But again, I think as we can be specific and concrete and set out very clear, measurable goals, it will be, we'll continue making steps.
Right, okay. Gentlemen, go back to it. Go on.
Maybe just a word here before we go back to the SaaS. I mean, as somebody that came from IT, I mean, I think it's just important to highlight, and it's something that I inside the company highlight quite a bit. You know, in the IT world, we started from pure software, and it took over 10 years to cloudify, right?
Oh, yes.
Through the very, very slow virtualization, then the fast virtualization, then the cloudification. And here, I mean, we're talking about going from specialized hardware to cloudification. And we're doing this in less than half that time, right? So something should be said at least.
That's very true.
To the pace we're at.
That's very true. I do remind all the telecommunications service providers and their suppliers tend to be like, I know I'm telco, and we move so slow. And it's like this myth that we continue to tell ourselves as an industry. And you are moving faster, and it is moving faster in many ways than other industries. So I think that it's a very aggressive transformation, and I wouldn't minimize the steps that have been made already.
Okay, thank you. Jehanne, can I bring you back in again? Yes, please do.
Jump back in the software as a service debate.
Wherever you'd like to go.
Because it's one of my points. I don't know if I want or if we want as CSPs a software as a service delivery model, as you said. But at least I think we need and we want it as a pricing model. Because if we want ourselves to be able to offer, to deliver or to create new offers on the on-demand type, which is the basic promise of the SDN NFV, to be able to manage on-demand services, on-demand offers, and so on. So if we want to enhance our portfolio with this type of offers, then we need a kind of back-to-back with the pricing model of the vendors, especially the VNF ones. And that's where I come to the pricing model of the software as a service. Even though it's not the delivery model, at least there is this question of pricing that is kind of pay-as-you-grow or pay-as-you-use, that allows ourselves to develop this type of business. And I think at the scale of the industry, it's a benefit for all of us because we will be able to develop new revenue streams based on this type of promises.
So I agree. I just, again, would like to add that, you know, we, outside of SaaS, right, we offer software in hosted format right now, right? We have been for as long as I can remember, I mean, 10, 15 years. And in fact, one of the challenges that we had, right, as a vendor when we started talking about SaaS is whether hosted is considered SaaS or not. So from a technology perspective, it's not. From a pricing model, it might be. I think the pricing model is easy, okay? Easier. The face went.
Yeah, so how it comes that you negotiate so...
Indeed.
So what I would point out, right, is...
Can you take a couple objectives of the multi-tenancy?
Hang on a sec.
Question?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So understand, it's not I inherently hate SaaS as a model, and I agree with you, right? The delivery, the way we deliver services to our customer would be SaaS, and so the pricing model has to line up to the way we work with our partners. our primary, and listen, we do actually use our partners in the way you've mentioned, where we take a segment of the solution and have people deliver it. Where it falls down is where the core service is delivered in that model. And it's not necessarily an economic or a philosophical argument. It's an end user experience perspective. It is, theoretically possible through the use of APIs and good contractual stuff and knock-to-knock peering that you can deliver a coherent, rational end user operational experience in that model. It's just stunningly rare that it's that smooth, and it really falls down when you need it the most. And so when you get overly reliant and people are operating a core service completely outside your infrastructure using a separate delivery team, the amount of energy that you have to put into making sure that that's not fully visible to the customer at the worst point in time, the smoothest of those operations is just that generally falls down. So when I'm using it for a fairly narrow function, absolutely an option. But we're seeing increasingly people sort of developing an enterprise-first strategy, and then where they want to host it for the enterprise customers, and slapping a CSP pricing scheme on it and saying, there you go. And by the way, and then we're retreating back to the old model where I got to spend $50 million up front for you to convert it to quote my model. Yeah, we're done with that, right? That's not going to happen anymore. And it is, so it just doesn't make sense for us, and that's not the mark of someone we're going to partner with.
Yeah, I would just interject that SaaS, the conversation about 5 nines everywhere is really one of those things where we saw many of the data centers and even the cloud service providers, they bifurcate their architecture. So, what's mission critical really is on mission critical architecture. And what can be hosted with SaaS, well, that's hosted with SaaS, but they don't mix the two. They're not fooling themselves into thinking something that is a core network service would be something that you would want to host as a SaaS on someone else's cloud. But expense systems, expense reporting, just from a data center view, of course, you can absolutely do that. So I think it's more about intelligent design and being purposeful about what the requirements are for the given service, and then being sure you design to those requirements.
And think about it. I mean, most enterprises today, right, move the core features, core services that they consume into consumption in SaaS, sometimes completely with an unknown infrastructure behind it. They just trust the providers of those cloud services to deliver the service at high quality. In many ways, I mean, I see this as an evolution, right? When a provider offers SaaS, right, whether they're a traditional vendor that is transforming or whether it's a startup that just started this way to begin with, right, the SLA matters. And I think SLAs, right, will become more the discussion than, where exactly it is hosted. Even within your own infrastructure, right? I mean,
so we're 100% on board with that as a model of the services, the way we deliver, and I think the way we collectively work together. I think your point about this is part. Our suppliers need to be part of that ecosystem that's delivering to the new mode, right? A cloudized model of delivery of services. And the exciting part about these solutions is they're not either/or solutions, as you pointed out. It's all about enabling people to pick the right mix of performance, cost, and security associated with the business value of the transaction they're trying to solve. And for the folks that get that and can partner with us to make that happen, you're just accelerating us all along, right? The explosion in cloud didn't take place because they built a more efficient way to sell services as the data center engineer, right? The cloud sales pitch went straight to the CFO and straight to the CIO, and it was a way of consuming services and something that aligned much better with people's business needs. And we have the opportunity collectively as an industry to make that transition as well. And so that means coming out of models where we shift risk to where, in ways that are not natural to the revenue flow, or we front load stuff, or we try to lock it in. Just as if it doesn't, what I would encourage people to do, back to my point about the SaaS piece about the end user experience, right? This isn't a philosophical bias towards one delivery model or another. It's all about, is the experience what the end user expects? Is it what they're willing to pay for? And similarly, if you really want to know what your North Star is in terms of what you should be aiming for, it's what's the best possible alignment with the customer's outcome and business process, outcome, business processes, and the way that they conduct business, and that should guide everything else that sits underneath that.
Lynn, you mentioned a few minutes ago APIs. They're becoming more important. Why is that, and what's the next step there?
When you're trying to do any level of decoupling, you need a stable place to land. And if you look, you can look at tons of different examples. You can look at the Apple platforms. You could even look and go way back in time to Microsoft WCL, the Windows Hardware Quality Lab. You had applications that tested on top of the API, and they were decoupled from the hardware that was tested underneath the API. And so it allowed these ecosystems to evolve somewhat decoupled, and a lot of innovation could happen. And in a similar way, you look at what cloud services are doing with new applications getting hosted on the cloud. You can spin up a new application, test whether it works or not. Is it popular? And if not, you just kill it. And if it is, then you make a decision about the demand. You've got a number of companies that started out with SaaS-hosted applications, complete startups born in the cloud, and then they realized, hey, wait a minute. For that money, I could do a data center, or I could be hosted in somebody else's architecture. And so they pulled it back in. And so it's really a much more intelligent way of designing, how am I going to deliver these services? And are they going to be something like Pokemon Go that's there for 2 months and goes away? Or is it going to be something that is a file encryption service that everyone needs when they're trying to interact and move files around?
For me, it's not only the question of stability, which is very true, of course, but it's also the question of interoperability. And you talked about the cloud service providers. They are in a very different dynamics than we are. And the DNA of telcos is the interoperability, and the basics, I suspect, are the new interoperability will be the APIs in the future. So it's really key for us, and it's a collective need from CSPs and from vendors that we specify, that even we standardize these APIs. It's not only an implementation, it's really a standard that we need if we want to achieve.
I would say if you don't standardize it, it will end up standardized. There are stories of storage instances on a specific cloud that vendors built APIs right to that instance because it was a de facto standard. And so you can end up with some of that. And it's not necessarily the best architected API for every cloud. So I think it's contingent on the service providers and the vendors to say these are the standards.
So these are approximately the two models, right? Either you have a de facto platform, you mentioned Windows, right? You want to run on Windows or not, right? Or standards, where you need to define it before many implementations get finalized. In this space, I feel we're a little bit stuck in between.
I don't oppose the two, and I don't consider one should be prior to the other.
No, I'm not saying one is prior to the other. I'm saying these are commonly used mechanisms to get compatibility. Here we're a little bit in between. We have almost an API defined by standards, but not completely, right? And then we have several platforms fighting to become de facto standards, and they're not compatible among them, right? So, I mean, from a VNF perspective, I can tell you, right, I mean, depending on which area we deal with, which customer we deal with, we need to accommodate, you know, an ETSI belief system, a TNF belief system, a proprietary belief system, a self-made belief system, right? Everybody's saying, okay, this is my standard, right?
But I consider that to make it viable at the ecosystem standpoint, we should solve this and consolidate or converge. I don't know how to phrase it.
I agree. Which one should we use?
And it's not it's not only this question of interoperability, it's also the question of viability of the value chain at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Let's over-index, right? I mean, people want to pick the winner all the time, and that IP, that didn't happen, right? I mean, it's just, you can pick all sorts of examples you want to. However, there's some things that people could do, again, in the standards community with each other, and this is, people are so worried about giving up a market advantage by standardizing around something that doesn't match them as the baseline. And in fact, if you try to apply a Pareto analysis that sort of said, all of us collectively know that we are not differentiated on 80% of what the customers exchange for basic capabilities, and you create a mechanism in the standard for you to be special for your particular implementation, you would take a ton of pain out of the end user experience and offer a better thing overall. Again, focus on the end user customer experience, focus on what the business is trying to achieve. If you applied that Pareto analysis and just nailed out that 80% that you're all the same anyways, despite what the marketing brochures say, and then really focus on the differentiated piece as an addition on top of that, we'd all benefit from that in terms of the way of just making things work together, being able to move a higher step in the business. Right now, we're all so focused on a feature function comparison between pseudo boxes, right? And in fact, there's a whole layer of value we can add by starting to abstract that capability up one layer and then building workflow management across that. That's a whole sector that people haven't captured yet in terms of value to the end customer that will never happen if we can't get over trying to be the one who controls the 85% of the API spec that none of your peers are going to agree on. Right, and it, we encourage that because amongst the carriers there's some disagreement about which standards to accept, and amongst the vendors there's not a lot of coordination, and collectively we end up offering a less than ideal experience to the folks that purchase our services.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to throw this open now to the floor. We have a roving microphone somewhere, maybe even two, I don't know. But if you would like to ask this panel any questions, and this isn't the sort of panel you find under a bush in the Buena Yoba Gardens or anything like that. It's an unusual collection of people, and they have a great deal of knowledge and information to impart, so don't be shy. Has anybody got any questions? If you don't, I've got plenty left. Andrew Coward, of course you have. Go on then, where's the... it's on its way around.
Good evening, panel. My question to the panel is, what does the panel see as the value of open source in the vendor transformation? It seems like we're skirting around this, but we haven't actually talked about it specifically this evening.
Okay, I'll start. Just because Intel has participated in contributing to open source for 15 years or so. It's been a long time. And we are one of the contributors to Linux kernel and OpenStack and at kind of a general compute level. One of the things that open source in general has allowed is a faster pace of innovation and a larger pool of developers. And one thing I continually hear from operators is, I can't recruit at Stanford like some of the other West Coast companies that are there. And so where are my software developers who know how to manage this fully virtualized automated environment coming from? And so one of the things that open source can do is accelerate the speed of innovation as well as give you access to a greater pool of developers with creative ideas. Notice that I didn't say it accelerates the speed of deployment, because open source is open source. You haven't gone through all the commercialization and hardening. And so I think that it's an important nuance to understand. There's innovation, developer pool, very good. We participate in multiple projects that look like they overlap somewhat. We do that at Intel because we know we don't want to drive the suppliers and vendors crazy with all the fragmentation. So we participate in all of them and try and pull them together to at least a point of consistency, if not where they could pass the same compliance tests.
So from my perspective, if I may, I mean, I agree on the point that you made regarding the speed of innovation, right? Every open source project that we either joined or initiated very quickly, became a multi-vendor environment where the community added more features than we would have been able to do in that time frame. On the speed to market, I think it kind of depends, right? Because in some cases, we actually see adoption getting accelerated as well, because in some way it fixes the compatibility issue that we discussed before. The problem with that is that it's not uniform. So I can't, from a business perspective, count on the fact that, okay, if we do open source, then we would accelerate from 2 years to a year, or from a year to 6 months. Right? It really depends on the specific project and the construct of the open source environment as a whole. But just one little point that I always like to make when we talk about open source is to define what is really open source and what isn't. Because my definition of open source requires a certain adoption and a certain participation in contribution. There are too many single vendor type of open source initiatives which I would not put in that category, right? Mm. We need to have a true community contributing, right, into every project to call something open source. Yeah. So that's just my little comment at the end.
Yeah, I will have the same comment to emphasize that for us as CSPs, what is useful in an open source community is also this collective work between CSPs and between vendors, and potentially between integrators also. An app is a good example of that. That makes it a true interoperable and common solution. And so it helps also to stabilize, to settle the ecosystem. So, and as you said, if it's fake community and driven by a single actor, it's not so useful. It's not so efficient, and so we miss part of the goal.
Apologies.
Excuse me.
Cautiously optimistic. Right, so I understand the theoretical benefits of this stuff, and I'm answering specifically for this domain, because Verizon contributes to other open source initiatives in different parts of its business, and we've seen benefit, but specifically in this domain, right? I get how it could help, I get the promise of how it could help, and I'm eagerly awaiting the arrival of the benefits, because I can't cash theoretical checks, right? And I can see a lot of stuff. I'd be repeating myself with a lot of things I think have to happen before some of this stuff starts to come to fruition. I think there's some basic building blocks that people have to get done to really see us be able to cash that check.
Thanks, Andrew. Anyone else? Gentleman here. We'll get a mic to you.
I just want to comment on the...
sorry to interrupt. Just tell us where you're from and who you represent.
My name is Mehmet Toy. I'm with Verizon. I'm in
I thought you might have been, yeah.
So
okay.
I want to comment on the API, standards APIs. I agree with the comments that the standards API helps interoperability, plus the decoupling the layers, which means really hides the complexity underneath the layers. Now, given that there are open source, open platforms, there are various initiatives there. To me, they are not standards. They are going to help the standards. They should help us to come up with the standard APIs, rather than saying that I have an open platform, you got to follow me. So they should help us to establish the standard APIs. There is actually an initiative in the MEF. It's called the Open API Initiative, which is really working with all other SDOs to come up with a unique standard APIs. Hopefully we will be successful in that.
Any comments on that? It was a statement rather than a question, but are there any comments on it?
There are a lot of different places that you can reuse APIs. There's programmable web, there's GitHub. GitHub is kind of a combination of interfaces and code snippets. And so it's a pretty consistent methodology. I do think in this space that in some cases, people might have been holding back because they view the operators as, well, you tell us what APIs you need or what APIs make sense in your architecture, because you are solving different problems differently. And so if there's a desire to go into the organizations that are already running, I think that's a really good option.
We have time for one more question if anybody would like to ask one. It would seem not, in which case I am going to bring this to a conclusion by asking actually the audience. You know that they say Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, as we saw in our recent elections. And so I would like to ask you to vote. Well, just a straw poll looking around here, having listened to the debate for the past 40 minutes. Do you think the two camps here have come to some kind of an accommodation and they can reassure one another that the CSPs are in this for the long haul and understand the vendors have their own problems? And what about the vendors looking at the real needs of the CSPs and are they meeting them? Who thinks that that accommodation has been reached in terms of this panel, and who thinks it hasn't? Let's start with who thinks it has. So, is there any point in those who think it hasn't? Okay, looks like we've got a long way to go. But I'd just like to say it's been an absolutely fascinating debate, very enjoyable. I'm glad you two didn't thump each other. Really, thanks very, very much indeed. I would like to say thank you for being here. It's getting tremendously hot up here, isn't it?
Yes.
We are starting to melt. It's time to call a halt to it. So would you please show your appreciation for a great panel in the usual way?
The bear hug.
Go. Peace breaks out.
Oh, peace breaks
Thank
out.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.